Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Murray. I'm the president of the National Museum of Language, and I'm delighted to have all of you with us today for a special presentation by Dr. Olenka Bilash. And we'll be learning a lot about Mother Tongue Day and Linguapax. So, uh, my role right now is just to give you a brief introduction to the National Museum of Language because we're not that well known. And many people who come to our speaker events have never actually heard of the museum before. And so I'm going to try to help you understand who we are and what we do in just a few minutes. Um, so we are an all virtual museum. We don't have a building. We exist online. We have a website. We do online speaker programs, such as the one we do today. We also do outreach activities, in-person um, events around the community when asked. And we have a lot of online resources and exhibits on our website. Um, so our mission statement, this was developed after a lot of back and forth between our officers and some liaisons we have around the country, is that we honor and support language acquisition, utilization, and preservation, along with linguistic and cultural diversity. And through our outreach activities and online resources, we celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication. So it's very broad, we're looking very broadly um, at language issues. The museum was brainchild of Dr. Amelia Murdoch, who was a linguist at the National Security Agency going back to 1971. And it took a long time to bring it to fruition. Uh, he actually launched the museum officially in 1997, so we're talking 26 years. Um, and at that time, we were the only museum in the world devoted to language issues. Um, since then, quite a few language museums have opened in different places around the world. Most of them are devoted to one language, usually the language of the country where they're based. Um, there's only one other museum that I'm aware of that has a broad outlook like we do, and that's called Mundo Lingua. That's in Paris. And they actually uh, were inspired somewhat by our museum because we were doing that first. Um, so we try to describe what we do as being along three themes. Um, One are universal aspects of language. And, like speech, for example, that's a universal aspect of language. Um, Also, languages in society. How is language used as part of, human life? And you could look at that as things like teaching language, translation, and interpretation. Those are well-known ways language is used in society, just the tip of the iceberg. And then on top of that, we cover a lot of different languages. So we say our third theme is the languages of the world. And for example, on our newsletter, which some of you may get every month, we have a language of the month where we highlight a specific language. And that's actually quite popular with people, especially if they know that language or they have family members who know that language or something like that. Um, we did have a physical space located in College Park, Maryland, near the University of Maryland from 2008 to 2013. Um, but maintaining a physical space is very costly in terms of human resources and just the expenses of it. And so that became untenable after a few years. Um, so at that point, we transitioned to what I would call a hybrid format, starting in 2013, 2014. Um, Hybrid meaning we started doing more things online. We transitioned some of our exhibits that we had had in the physical museum to online exhibits. But we still did some in-person events in borrowed spaces, community spaces where we'd have speaker programs and set up some of our exhibits and things like that. So that went on until 2020, when the pandemic hit and everybody had to lock down and stay home. And for us, we saw this as a challenge and then an opportunity because we were already doing a lot of things online. So we actually transitioned very smoothly to the uh, almost completely online format, although we would still do some outreach activities. Um, Another big change was in 2021, we launched our liaison program. As prior to that time, we had focused mainly on the local area in the Washington metropolitan area, Maryland, Virginia, DC, close to where we had our physical facility. Um, and although we had a lot of programs that related to things outside the Washington area, most of the people who attended were local folks. Um, so in the liaison program, we reached out to people around the country and invited people to become what we call the state liaison. And this is a purely volunteer activity. We didn't pay them, but there were enough people who wanted to do it. So we have liaisons, almost 60 liaisons now, representing about 40 states and the District of Columbia and a few foreign countries. And what these liaisons do is they help us spread information about our programs and events, and also give us information about language activities that are going on in their area, which we then can publicize on our website. Um, so this has been a big expansion for us in terms of our scope. 2021, we also received one of our first significant grants. This was called a SHARP grant. This was from money in the law passed called the American Rescue Plan. So it was supporting the humanities in the American Rescue Plan, or SHARP grant. And it was $10,000, which for us was like a really tremendous gift from the federal government to help us with general operating expenses. Um, so we continue to engage in having speaker programs. We try to make them really interesting and but focus on a lot of different topics that you might not hear about, normally. So that's where we are for today. Um, just to give you a brief idea of some of our major exhibits that you can look at on our website. We have an 1812 exhibit about emerging American language uh, after, during and after the War of 1812, which of course was with the British. A big event in the United States because if we had lost that war, we'd have been part of the Commonwealth um, instead of an totally independent country. We have an exhibit called Dictionary of American Regional English, or DARE. So this is a big project that's being done at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They've been doing it now for 60 years. And they originally, in the 1960s, they sent researchers out all over the country to collect information about regional American English and compile massive dictionaries, which they update from time to time. So we have another really popular exhibit we have is Philagalos. Philagalos is a collection of jokes. Some call it the world's oldest joke book, that were, I guess, developed in ancient Greece around 400 AD. And this is a very popular exhibit. Is we have one of our officers is also an artist, and she created cartoons. So you can see them on the website. These jokes are presented as cartoons. And we have the original Greek and an English translation of the joke. So we also have children's stories in a variety of languages, in the original language and in English translation. around the world. We have a big poetry exhibit called The Power of Poetry about social justice themes and poetry from around the world, again, in original languages and in English. We have something we developed called a virtual cruise to Puerto Rico, which is 4 30-minute segments. Um, they're very colorful and talk about various aspects of life in Puerto Rico in English and Spanish. And we've had a big focus on Africa because nobody else was really looking at that. We decided to, so we have a lot of African poetry that's on our website in our Power of Poetry exhibit. And we also did a big event a couple of years ago, focusing on African poetry with social justice themes. And that's recorded and it's available on our website. So this just gives you an idea of some of the scope of what we do and, um, how we try to serve the public, as a language museum. I think I'm done. Didn't want to take up all of our speakers' time. Unless there's any burning questions.
No, I think at this point, I think we should probably get to the speaker. I'm
Absolutely.
Greg Nedved. I'm the former president of the museum, and I want to acknowledge a couple of people. We have Emily Murray, who is our webmaster today for this event, and Gary McCone, who's a former president of the museum. In our audience might be someone else that I don't recognize that is a museum officer. But I want to go ahead and introduce very quickly our speaker, Dr. Olenka Bilash, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, which I think is in Edmonton, Canada. And she served as the director of the last 20 years on the board of Linguapax. And we're going to find out today what Linguapax is all about and its big claim to fame, at least as I understand it, and she'll certainly tell us about this, is International Mother Language Day. So we're going to be hearing about that. Very quickly, her resume speaks to eclectic interdisciplinary collaborations with art, humanities, fine arts, medicines, and science. She's an award-winning teacher and researcher who has shepherded, I love that word, dozens of graduate students from 5 continents across the world throughout their language-related research programs. And she has a recent book from the year 2024, just last year, on the impact of 50 years of multiculturalism in public education. And the publisher is Brill, B-R-I-L-L. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Olenka Bilash. Olenka, it's all yours.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Was just going to offer a couple of technical notes. Sorry about that. Before we get started.
Sorry.
So our program is scheduled to run until around 4:00 p.m. Eastern time today. And we will be planning a short break, probably somewhere around 3:00 p.m. Eastern time, just a 5-minute break, so everyone can anticipate that. Also, we will generally be saving questions for the end of the program. I understand Dr. Bilash has a lot of content to present, so please go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat. We will be saving plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end of the formal presentation, and we will keep track of those as they come in. We do ask everyone to keep themselves muted unless they're speaking. You're welcome to have your camera on or off. We actually love to see everyone on camera. If you were comfortable with that, not required. But if you could remain muted until it's time for the Q&A discussion and you're called on to ask your question. Without further ado now, I will turn things over to Dr. Bilash for our formal presentation. And again, thank you everyone for attending today.
Well, thank you for your kind words and warm welcome. I had the pleasure of having a longer chat with Emily and Greg, and it wasn't Laura. Who was the other person I met with on Thursday?
Dr. Robbins.
Yes, Dr.
Jill Robbins.
Yes, Jill. And what I'm learning is how much we have in common, we at Linguapax and you at the National Museum. And I hope some of that will come through in this chat, and that at the end, we'll have a chance to look at maybe possible collaborations. So I'm going to begin my chat with showing you my slides, because it's always more interesting than looking at one person, I think. And can you all see the screen? Good.
Yes, I can.
Thank you. And by wishing us all a happy International Women's Day. I hope that you're being celebrated as you deserve, remembering all the women in the world and the fact that no one would be here without a woman. Okay. The proposal for today's agenda is I'm going to tell you a bit about who I am, or who am I, in terms of some of the background that feeds into how I became involved in Linguapax. Then I'll give you a brief history of Linguapax, including talking about its philosophy and some of its projects and contributions, which, as you already know, include Mother Language Day, but there is more. And then hopefully have an exciting discussion. So my road to Linguapax, I guess you could say, began, when I was a young child, without realizing it. I grew up in a kind of bicultural and an extended family. And I remember in first year sociology learning what an extended family was. And that's when people of multi generations often stayed together and lived together. And in my case, I did have a mother, but all of my father's sisters and his brother's wives were also my mothers in a certain way. And so that's kind of a definition of an extended family. And my father's family spoke Ukrainian, but his family came in 1896 to Canada. So if you looked at the Ukrainian he spoke with contemporary Ukrainian, they're a fair distance apart, but of course they would understand one another. My mother was not Ukrainian. And the interesting thing there is that my mother was disowned by her family for marrying a Ukrainian. And so with that, I really did grow up with a strong awareness of the minority status of some people, some cultures, as well as some languages. I had some senior family members who had the financial resources to be able to travel, and I would just absorb everything they told me and all of their pictures and films about other parts of the world. So I think I've been an armchair traveler for a long time, and as soon as I could get my own means, I traveled on my own. I was always interested in languages and eager to communicate. It was a bit like a math formula. My sister and I developed our own language, and we used it all the time. Of course, we used it when we didn't want other people to know what we were talking about, which has become a point in research about some of the reasons people use the different languages that they have. But I know that there are some learners of languages that go through a kind of silent period and maybe a little bit more shy and not eager to participate, more self-conscious, particularly of pronunciation. I just never seemed to be one of those. I could just hardly wait to try using whatever was being taught in the classroom. In 1971, the concept or the policy, the National Federal Policy for Multiculturalism, was introduced to Canada. And that was quite a turning point for me as a student. In fact, it kind of allowed me and my peers to talk about things that were never discussed in school. In fact, I remember that one of our assignments in an English class was to talk about a cultural event from our families. And I remember listening to my peers give their stories and realizing how much I didn't know about any of them. And I'm sure they felt the same. Well, that's another way of saying that certainly at that time we had to separate our home identity, our cultural identity, our linguistic identity from the mainstream. And what we showed was really, in my case, the part of Canada I lived in, the use of English and adhering to the rules of the classroom. I went on to university and got a BA with a major and minor in languages and sociology. I was president of the French club and the German club. And one of the activities I did is we put on some French plays and we went to schools and performed them to try to get youth, junior high, elementary and junior high students who were learning French or German or other languages interested in continuing to learn those languages. As a student, I engaged in study abroad. So I was able to go to France. I was able to go to Germany to study. I studied in the former Soviet Union. And I also was able to participate in some unique cultural experiences in Quebec. And that was more or less during part of their cultural revolution. And so it was really interesting for me. Fortunately, I could speak French well enough to communicate. I was even interviewed on the radio and on television. However, one of the things that happened was some of the young people were very angry to have an Anglophone in their presence. So when we calmed them down and started a communication, I began to realize that, the deep feelings about the Quebecois and their identity, which had been evolving for, 300 or 400 years. I was always fascinated by bilingual education. Perhaps I should even say envious that it came about and came into the literature before I ever had a chance to participate in it. But I always believed that learning more languages was a road to peace in the world, because my belief, and it was, pretty raw and undeveloped at the time, but that it would facilitate understanding and mutual respect. I went on to become a second language teacher, a principal, eventually with my PhD, even before then, a teacher educator. In 1978-79, I was the bilingual coordinator of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I produced this little booklet. And this booklet, I have come to realize, is quite a rare thing. It's rare because many people don't have copies of it. And in this booklet, I did, for the time, and you have to remember this is long before computers could do searches, I did quite a broad literature review. So I looked at what are some facts that we know about language education, particularly starting the learning of languages at a very young age, kindergarten or grade 1. What programs looked like, how bilingual education differed from other programs, how children benefited, the research at that time done on language and thinking skills, the cultural component in the program, multiculturalism and language, some of the myths, dispelling the myths, and looking at other concerns that parents might have. I spoke to parent groups throughout about 5 provinces about bilingual education. And most of the time I was dispelling fears. And if you can imagine, and perhaps many of you can relate, your very first child is going into kindergarten and you want the very best for that child. And is this the right choice? From 79 to 81, I became the supervisor of second languages for the County of Strathcona, which is a school jurisdiction. And I began the French immersion program there, the German bilingual program, and the Ukrainian bilingual program. Now, this booklet also becomes rather important because without any reason or any personal contact, the very well-known Joshua Fishman sent me a certificate and a letter of congratulations. Now, he was in New York at the time, so I was always curious how a booklet like this that was made in Edmonton, Alberta, and there were no internet resources at the time, reached his hands. But this was a very nice tribute, although I still didn't even realize how important Joshua Fishman was to this movement. In the 1980s, I became involved doing some research for what's called the Multilingual Biblioservice. And again, you have to go back in time to realize it's pre-internet days. And we developed or acquired some grants. First of all, we did a feasibility study, then acquired grants to purchase books in different languages so that families could go to their local library and either receive or order some of the books for a certain period of time that would be on record. Also in the 80s, I became more involved with the heritage languages through an organization called the Alberta Ethnic Language Teachers Association, and helped them to develop a curriculum for teacher training for heritage language community schools, and also instruct it in that program at the end of the 80s and in the 90s. In between, I did a master's in cultural geography. So again, my passion for seeing the world and looking at how people mark the cultural landscape, or how culture marks the geographical landscape. I did my PhD in fear and creativity, which may not seem related, but I think the most important thing out of those studies for me was looking at fear and how fear becomes a constraint for so much that we do. In the 80s, I also became involved in learning resource development, and that means developing books, activities, media, etc. And I was doing it initially for the Ukrainian community, and then I was called upon to help many of our indigenous groups. So the Sarsi, Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Stoney, and went on to teach the very first accredited methodology course for them. And I could tell you lots of stories, interesting stories about that. The Ukrainian development work was a grade 1 to 6 program that was based on integrating listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and having much more child action. Of course, you can't teach grade 1 children a second language like the tradition had been for teaching adults at university. So they had to be active. In 1990, I became involved in a literacy project in Cameroon and spent some time there. One of the big eye-openers, well, 2 big eye-openers for me at that time. When I arrived, there were 236 languages identified in Cameroon, and by the time I left, there were 237. So new languages were sort of being discovered, and they had worked very hard to distinguish between a language and a dialect, and these were definitely new languages. Some spoken by as little as 5,000 people and others by 1 million. The other thing that was a fascinating eye-opener was how most of the people I met were at least quadrilingual. However, they were illiterate. And so you would see along many of the roads people who would pull out little typewriters for the day, set them up on a table, and others would come to them with documentation that needed a response. And these people were hired, I guess, to write out responses that they would take to the government. So again, it really changed or broadened my notion of multilingualism. In the same year, but much later, well, at the end of that year, actually, I became involved in teaching a course, a methodology course in Paraná, Brazil. That's in southern Brazil. And the reason for that was that up until that year, compulsory education had extended to grade 4, and now they were going to expand it to grades 5 to 8. And that expansion meant more teacher training, some language courses that the teachers had to pass, as well as some methodology training. As I mentioned, I also was involved in methodology courses for Indigenous languages. During my time working with Indigenous groups, I feel very honored to have received various names. And those names, I don't know what they called me behind my back, but the names that they gave me are really in a ceremonial way. So the first name I was given was that of a peacemaker. And I often would reflect and say, I don't know why, but okay. Later with time, I realized that some of the courses had teacher participants from different language groups or different reserves that didn't always have a positive history of collaboration. And I guess in the context of my courses and the kind of group work that I always encourage, some of those barriers were broken. So I was excited to learn that. I've been called, or one of my names was that of a badger. And when you look that up, it means you're bold, you're courageous, focused, self-reliant, strong, with tenacity. Well, I thought that was pretty good at describing me at the time. One of my Blackfoot names is Pitaki, which means eagle woman, very high honor. And one of my Cree names is Opastasio, which means whirlwind. And that was given to me by a group of teachers that were working on the first Cree bilingual program. And I was going in and out. That was in Saskatchewan, our neighboring province, and helping them with resource development. And they said, when you come in, you look at everything we do and you give us all these new ideas. It's like a whirlwind. Everything gets torn apart and upside down. Then you go away. We manage to take all your ideas and settle down. And then you come back and do it again. So it was said definitely with love and affection. In the late 90s and early 2000, I also began to do some work on internationalization of the University of Alberta. And that took me to many places in the world in search of developing memorandums of understanding to work with different universities and different funding institutions in these countries. So I traveled fairly broadly in South America and also in Japan, South Korea, and eventually China. At the end of the 90s, or the last half of the 90s, I was invited to be a part of a project with South Africa. That was just when apartheid was being abolished. And you could see many of the remnants of apartheid in their textbooks, in their curricula, in the schools that still existed at that time. And I was able to observe some of those transitions that were being made from the apartheid era to a post-apartheid era. Later, at the beginning of the 2000, I also was involved in what eventually became their official languages policy. As of the year 2000 in Japan, I was invited to Japan as a part of the Hokkaido, that's the northernmost island of Japan, Alberta's sister relationship, and I did some teacher training there, and that led to a very long-term relationship where I went to Japan every year until COVID, and eventually was invited to become the Honorary Consul General of Japan in Edmonton. So I started to wear more of a diplomatic hat. I've continued to work with graduate students and always emphasized the importance of language policy, and that returns me to Joshua Fishman. And some of you may or may not be familiar with his work on what I usually refer to as GIDS, which is what does GIDS stands for? Intergenerational Development Scale. What's the G? Oh my gosh. I think I'm calling it GIDS too much. At any rate, Fishman's work was really important because what he did was analyze different societies where languages were in a state of being lost, and looked at and developed an 8-stage classification system. And with that classification system, it enabled communities to be able to look at themselves. So the idea would be being in a stage 1, where the use of your language is being used in higher education. You need it for different jobs. You can go to the government and media and use the language. Whereas the worst scenario would be when most of the users are very, very senior, and it's used, for those people intermingling just amongst themselves, socially, and maybe even just ceremonially. And in between, we see what it is that we try to build. Of course, you can use GIDS to record language shift, but you can also use it to reverse language shift. And the work that I've done with with Indigenous people have worked precisely on these 8 stages. And I would say, well, I can talk about that another time or later. Sorry. Okay, what's going on here? It's not allowing me.
Olenka, it's graded intergenerational interruption scale.
Graded. Thank you, Joy. I knew someone would come up with that. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that I forgot it. Joshua Fishman, please forgive me. Now, his work has gone on to be called eGrid, and has been used, and you can see that it's expanded now to over 10 different levels. So why I'm telling you this personal story is because you can see in my background the braiding of languages and cultures, education, and peace. And that takes us to the history, or one more thing. In those years, I was also the co-founder of the Foundation for Endangered Languages Canada. And this organization focuses primarily on endangered languages. And so our focus was on Indigenous languages in Canada. For a number of years, I also was their communications officer, and I developed a regular newsletter that I sent out. And in that way, it became a kind of documentation of how Indigenous languages were becoming increasingly more accepted in society, and the status of Indigenous languages was changing. So that leads us to Linguapax. So Linguapax as a term or as a notion was developed by the Catalan Miguel Siguan. It's really important that we recognize this is the Catalan and not a Spaniard, because Catalan and Catalonia has worked very hard to preserve their national identity. And in fact, well, Miguel was an emigre under the Franco regime in Spain. And then he was able to return after Franco's death. He became a leading psychologist in Spain, the leading scholarly specialist supporting the Catalan Renaissance, the only professor of psycholinguistics in Spain at the time, the director of teacher training and retraining at the University of Barcelona, and an internationally revered expert in many fields. So this is the birth of Linguapax. I'm going to go through now. Some places what I read were 5 stages of development. I'm going to very clearly outline 3 stages for you, and indicate that at the beginning it was a UNESCO initiative. And the desire was to bring a solution to specific issues in the area of peace research, the defense of human rights, and the promotion of education for democracy by using innovative methods for language teaching. So it was kind of bringing together peace activists and human rights activists, and second language teachers. And I would trace this to being the roots of what we would now probably call global citizenship. This philosophy is now embedded in the Linguapax Institute. It is now an NGO based in Barcelona, and it aims to promote peace through the respect of linguistic diversity and the promotion of plurilingual education. So let's look a little more closely at the history of Linguapax. So we're going to call this stage 1, the foundational phase, from 1987 to 1993. So a little reminder of what was taking place in the world at the time, that the international peace movement after World War II was emerging as a coalition of groups within Western powers, mainly the USA and the USSR. One could see it as the continuation of the anti-fascist solidarity movement and a Soviet effort to legalize former international ties. Remember that nobody knew at the time that the Soviet Union was going to break up. That, excuse me, the budding decomposition of the Soviet Union, and kind of a change of the bipolar world, as we will soon see the split of the Iron Curtain. Glasnost and Perestroika were just around the corner. So in 1987, UNESCO held a consultative meeting on the content and methods of teaching foreign languages and literatures for peace and understanding. This was held in Kyiv, and specialists from 14 countries were invited. The end of the meeting resulted in what was called the Kyiv Declaration and nicknamed Linguapax. And they made 7 recommendations. So what are those recommendations? The first one refers to teachers of foreign languages and literatures. And the vision was that teachers of languages should consider that what they are teaching is more than just languages, but also have the responsibility for furthering international understanding, including mutual understanding, respect, peaceful coexistence, and cooperation in accordance with UNESCO principles. that teachers should be organizing extracurricular activities for the development of international languages and cultures and cooperation. And that this required, excuse me, learning tasks and classroom activities that stimulated students' initiatives, interests, and needs. In other words, becoming more student-directed. The second recommendation was to relevant international and intergovernmental organizations that UNESCO should cooperate, or that they should seek cooperation from UNESCO for teacher preparation and training seminars for foreign language teachers around the world in the spirit of peace and understanding among nations. And that these new ideas should be broadly disseminated and tested, these new approaches to teaching languages, so that they could be broadly disseminated. The third point was that there should be, and now this is more at a national level, that there should be exchange of teachers and teaching materials, syllabi, audiovisual materials, that there should be an increase in the number of foreign languages that are available for instruction locally, and excuse me, that languages or courses in languages for special purposes, including science and technology, should be developed. And the fourth one was to the Director General of UNESCO, indicating that there should be more development of teaching foreign languages for the purpose of peace and understanding, that initiatives should be taken almost immediately. A handbook for foreign language teachers should be developed. They should create international competitions for the best teaching materials, for example. That there should be respect for languages that aren't necessarily broadly spoken. In other words, small language groups, or lesser spoken languages, as they have sometimes been called. That there should be the decade of cultural development, 1988 to 1997, should also support a decade of language development. And at the end of this meeting, an international Linguapax committee was elected to oversee this. So we're still in stage one, but I think we could conclude that the goal was not that of adding another ethnocentric perspective of another language, but helping all languages develop a broader perspective that there are many languages out there, and that by learning a language, that should help you become more open to other languages. In other words, to open the students' eyes to linguistic and cultural diversity. Also, a shift to seeing language as a tool for communication and not just a set of knowledge, grammar, lexicon, knowledge for its own sake. And that languages should be used in the service of understanding and respect. They argued that there should be more translation used in teaching languages, because that would help students see what languages have in common. Stage one, within Linguapax, they also call Linguapax 1, Linguapax 2. And I think that that's referring more or less to the opportunities that people had to gather in person. So Linguapax 2 consisted of a series of languages and education seminars in 1988. In 1989, the International Committee met in Venice. Linguapax 3 took place in Saarbrücken and created a book entitled Peace Through Language Teaching. And these books are edited books with collections from multiple authors. In 1991, they met in Hungary on the occasion of the 17th FIPLV, and that's the French Fédération Internationale pour la Promotion de Langue Vivante, de professeurs de langue vivante. And but again, there were multiple workshops that were held, and the partnership between FIPLV continued, particularly through Dennis Cunningham, who was himself a second language teacher in Australia. So if we were to kind of summarize this period, this first stage, we could say that it began in 1987 with the retirement of someone named Viktor Koptilov, an official who initiated the set of meetings at the University of Kyiv. And it could be characterized by foreign language instruction, gave students broader perspectives and ways to break national egocentricity and thereby contribute to international understanding and solidarity. The aims of this period of Linguapax were to harmonize peace education and language education, and to promote international understanding, international communication, global education, and linguistic humanism. Now I'm looking at my clock and I'm thinking that this might be a good time for us to take a break because it's at the end of one period and before another. How a 5-minute break, would that work for everybody?
Yeah, this would be a perfect time for that. So I see 2:55 Eastern time on my clock. So if everyone could return by around 3 o'clock Eastern, then we'll resume the rest of the program.
5 minutes is fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this was the last slide I was on. And the next slide has a big but word in it. And that is that although this vision had become clear, UNESCO was steeped in an economic crisis that made it impossible to fund any new programs. And it was reticent to take on initiatives that might be unpopular with state governments, and therefore it backed up a little bit. Another way of saying this is that Linguapax was only surrounded by great enthusiasts, but also great determination. So we enter stage 2, which we will call the golden years, 1994 to 1999. And Joseph Poth from France became the enthusiastic director of a new language division at UNESCO with a strong technical team. And he was able to help UNESCO Catalonia develop a status as a center. And so it's called UNESCO CAT, meaning UNESCO Catalonia. It launched a number of projects, and I think the big thing that we will see is it became much more global, and it did begin to affect policies, get the attention of communities, and foster more multilingual education. So Linguapax 4, so we're still in stage 2, but remember we've looked at 1, 2, and 3 were major meetings that resulted in books of some sort. Linguapax 4 took place in Barcelona, and as you can see, there's a fairly large number of people. I'm sorry, I don't actually have on record the number of participants or countries. But in 1995, Felix Martí, also from Catalonia, described Linguapax as a network of experts, a collection of innovatory initiatives designed for peace, and teachers of foreign languages. Now, this tripartite proposal is important because it didn't mean that every person in Linguapax met all three of these criteria. Lots of people were teachers of foreign languages. There were people who were teachers working in peace education. And of course, there were experts in peace education, in languages, in endangered languages, etc. But they were beginning to come together in a network. Linguapax held another meeting in 1996 in Bilbao. And again, there was a seminar. Now, a year later, Felix Martí is beginning to shape a little more clearly the objectives of Linguapax for this era: to advise governments of member states of UNESCO who so desire on the planning of linguistic policies, to protect linguistic diversity, and to help educators, especially those working in the field of languages, with methodologies for the education of peace, tolerance, and international understanding by creating adequate pedagogical materials. So this is much closer to what we currently understand, and you can kind of see its evolution out of its first foundational stage. Linguapax 5 excuse me, took place primarily in Australia. Again, we see Dennis Cunningham's important role on behalf of FIPLV and how he was able to put that on their international, on the agenda of their international meeting, and in particular, working in the Asia Pacific region. There were proceedings that came out of this, published by Michael Candelier and Dennis Cunningham, and that's Linguapax 5. In that same year, UNESCO sent a Linguapax delegation to the Japanese Teachers Association of Language Teachers, which was held in the city of Peace, Hiroshima, and attended by 2,300 participants from Asia, Europe, North America, and Australia. To further highlight the Linguapax conference presence, the theme of a peace strand was integrated into that conference. In 1996, we begin to see also more events across Korea and Thailand, as well as Japan, and those are mainly through organizations such as TESOL, the Teaching of English as a Second or Other Language. 1997, again, the FIPLV organization gets involved with their international meeting in Recife in Brazil. And but simultaneously, the IATEFL organization meeting in Brighton begins to pick up the stream on peace and education, as well as bringing Linguapax into the fore. The Universal Esperanto Association in Australia becomes informed about Linguapax. And also, again, Dennis Cunningham, working in Australia, taps into a number of national organizations, and they all become more informed. By this point, Linguapax has a certain amount of activity in 11 countries. In 1998, there is a meeting and workshop in Burkina Faso. In 1999, Federico Meyer, who then becomes Director General of UNESCO, expresses a clear desire to get involved in protecting languages and fostering multilingual education, which leads to the birth of International Mother Language Day, which you are all familiar with, and I'm assuming in some way continue to celebrate. In the year 2000, we now have Linguapax 8 organizing a meeting in Kyiv again. Unfortunately, this time it is to actually dissolve the UNESCO committee. So it's no longer part of UNESCO, but it is a part of UNESCO Catalunya. And it continues with the mandate that it has self-created and that I've already described to you. I would say that this now ushers in stage 3. And stage 3 begins with a not so stable base because, as I've said, it no longer is supported financially by UNESCO, and Joseph Poth retires. We lose a person. And as you all know, in an organization, there are times when an organization exists because of some very strong personality and everyone else is still interested. But when that personality steps away for whatever reason, sometimes there's not a sustainable future. But thankfully, Felix Martí continues with in Catalonia, and Linguapax continues to try to expand its aims and commitment and maintain linguistic plurality around the world and protection of endangered languages. So if we think for a moment about stage 1, the term endangered languages was never used. There was the growing desire to have other languages talked about, not just the common kind of international languages, but now there's a much greater awareness about different ways of classifying languages. In 2001, the international NGO Linguapax is officially created with its headquarters in Barcelona. And as I mentioned, it becomes this network formed by sociolinguists, language community experts, and officials from national and international organizations concerned about languages and peoples, and representatives of organizations dedicated to facing global challenges. And it began to promote actions tailored to the needs of different issues locally and universally. This is a really important point because up until now, it's not that people weren't taking actions, they were, but they were, I would say, more or less gathering support, gathering interested parties, kind of doing an inventory of what currently exists. And now that inventory has been completed, and they're able to see the lie of the land and what possible actions could be taken. So I would say this really is the beginning of an international scope with members from Europe, from Asia and the Pacific, from Africa, and from Latin America and the Caribbean. Not all of the countries in those regions, but at least a couple, and enough to create these kind of Linguapax subsidiaries, if I may. In 2002, FIPVL met in Barcelona. And so once again, Linguapax is on the agenda. In 2004, the World Congress on Dialogue on Language Diversity, Sustainability, and Peace is launched in Barcelona. 141 days of this international event, and Linguapax again is involved. In 2006, FIPLV is again involved. In Linguapax 9, that means that there was some kind of a written document that comes out of it. The first Linguapax Africa conference took place, as I mentioned earlier, and in Cameroon. Remember where I was in my early years? Cameroon. And in fact, we'll see that one of the award recipients of the Linguapax Award is actually the person that I worked with in Cameroon, Maurice Tadejeu. In 2009 is when I started to, or I was invited to join Linguapax. At that time, we met in Barcelona. You could see it was, my first impression was very positive. The mayor, the governor of the state gave warm addresses. Everything was expenses paid. The speakers were renowned linguists. The conversation was deep and rich and informed and aimed at, I think, helping us see what existed and what we might be able to do locally. Now, since that time, partly because, as I mentioned earlier, I was going to Japan on an annual basis, I was able to participate in the Linguapax Asia conferences. And then I was invited to be a North American representative. The other thing I want to mention about the Barcelona meetings in 2009 was the some new arguments that were surfacing about the value of languages, and in particular, the defense of endangered languages. And that was the ecological value. So people were beginning to be able to see that indigenous languages all over the globe had this tremendous amount of knowledge about the local ecological systems, about the plants. And if you look carefully at the names of the plants in those languages, they embedded the purposes of those plants, whether they were healing plants or identifiers for things that should take place seasonally. As well, there were people that were beginning to work at developing formulas to identify the economic benefits of being multilingual or of recognizing different languages in different countries. I want to just go back to Maurice Tadejeu in Cameroon for a moment. The project that I went there for was a literacy project, and it was to challenge the government's position that children should begin their literacy development in the official language, either French or English, because Cameroon was had two official languages at the time. And to challenge it to say, no, children should begin to develop their literacy in their mother tongue. And so you can imagine how, if they don't win that argument, how many children and how many languages fall by the wayside, because without that education in their mother tongue, they stop using it essentially, particularly if it doesn't have economic benefit. So I'm going to switch now. Instead of moving on from 2019 on, I'm going to talk about the legacies and embed things that have been happening in Linguapax since then. So first, I'll mention International Mother Language Day, the Linguapax Awards, the Linguapax Review, the awareness building, and the fact that all of what they're doing becomes, I think, a written record of efforts to build an infrastructure for education for peace, linguistic diversity, and human rights through language. So, International Mother Language Day. it's very interesting for me on the 21st or sometimes the 22nd to do a YouTube search for what's happened on that day, and to notice how some countries really embrace this day and others do not seem to embrace it as a country, but there could be small enclaves of people here and there that do embrace it. Now, in Edmonton over the years, we were able to get the mayor to acknowledge International Mother Language Day with a declaration. And that declaration is always read and referred to on February 21st. I think that this is a type of action, and these are the types of actions that we'd like to see more of. Certainly, if you can get one mayor to do it, you kind of have a precedent, and that might be a precedent for others to do it. It is a declaration and as an acknowledgement of the different languages spoken by the many residents of that city. The other thing is the Linguapax Awards, and they began in 2002. And when I was first introduced to them, I thought of them as awards that went primarily to researchers. And some of these researchers would have been researchers of endangered languages, people who'd committed 40, 50, 60 years of their lives to even developing a literary for, the alphabet for a language, or exploring the language so that they could figure out its grammar, etc. I mean, long-term commitment. Since then, there's been more emphasis, equal emphasis, but more on the revitalization and reactivation of communities. Therefore, not only the promotion of multilingualism, but recognition of individuals who are part of that movement. So they might be linguistic activists more than they are linguistic researchers. And always within the frame of building societies that respect linguistic and cultural differences. This is a list of the awards that award winners of the Linguapax Awards since 2002. And I'm just going to remind you that, you know, some of the people on these on this list are people that I encountered in the little biography that I shared with you. Joshua Fishman, Maurice Tadejeu, Neville Alexander in South Africa. So I always find it interesting as I meet people who are in the later stages of their lives to look at their life histories and how things from early years begin to piece together in a way that you can see a puzzle that you couldn't see when you were just living through it. And anyone amongst you who who's familiar with research literature will recognize many of these names. But I also want to know to bring to your attention that in 2011, that was the first year that we actually decided to give 2 awards because we were debating at that time whether we should stick with honoring the researchers or also acknowledge the activists. And at that time, we had thought at one point of giving a research award one year and an activist or a community award the next, and taking turns. But if we look at these award winners, you'll be able to see organizations that are being acknowledged sometimes about every second year. Now, the other thing that I think Linguapax might be less known for is a kind of journal that's called the Linguapax Review. The first issue came out in 2010, and if you can find that online, it's free. You will be able to read more of the history of Linguapax. But it was also designed to assess what is happening in the world's languages on different continents and to help increase awareness of language loss. So the first review in 2010 was called Glimpses into the World's Languages. The next one didn't come out till 2014, and this focused on the management of multilingualism in urban settings. In 2015, it was the role of youth in language revitalization. Sorry, I realize I've got these in opposite order. That's just going to challenge you. You know, some languages are read top to bottom, some bottom to top, some right to left, some left to right. We'll just exercise our eyes here. 2016 focused on digital media and language revitalization. 2017, a kind of reflective issue on old and new frontiers and emerging scenarios. 2018, more about languages and action. 2019, language revitalization and schooling initiatives with a particular focus on revitalization of the Hawaiian language. Now, I remember going to Hawaii for as a prize for something I did in about the year 2000, 2001. And the first thing I did was contact the Hawaiian language schools so that I could visit and see them in action. Very exciting for me. Remember my passion for bilingual education. In 2020, there was a focus on translation, looking at its angles, from different angles, its practices, its advantages, and its dangers. In 2021, language technologies and language diversity. In 22, cinema and language revitalization. In 2023, heritage languages and the well-being of speakers. And that takes us to looking at, I think, a very good contribution, but one that may not be that well known. I promised to tell you a little bit about the Linguapax philosophy, and I think the key points are that we look at and assess problems that affect linguistic diversity. So the goal is always at promoting more languages and giving the people that speak those languages and therefore the languages increased empowerment. We condemn new forms of cultural and linguistic colonialism and the passivity with which globalization has really addressed linguistic diversity. In other words, they haven't done that very well. And Linguapax honors the people who have distinguished themselves by protecting the lives of languages and dedicating their lives to that through the Linguapax Award. And we strive to collaborate more and more with grassroots communities and with governments. And, you know, for those who will join Linguapax in the future or might pick it up, I think that they are heirs to a happy story and ambassadors for the organization on every continent. There are now Linguapax branches in Africa, Asia, Eurasia, Latin America, North America, Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe. The last one is a new branch that opened only a few years ago. Linguapax Asia is probably one of the most active branches. As I said, they have annual conferences And these conferences, I know one of the last events, they took a group and went to Hawaii to visit the Hawaiian immersion program. Linguapax Africa was quite active in 2006, 2009, 2011. Unfortunately, Maurice Tadeusz passed away, and I think that we really definitely saw less being done in Africa, and are probably awaiting a new spirit to take some leadership there. Linguapax Europe Central also is active with some seminars promoting, again, minority languages. And I use the word minority in the sense that they aren't necessarily recognized by their states. Linguapax Latin America has been the most active, I would say, with environmental education and that ecological approach that I mentioned earlier. They've also worked on the integration of music in particularly Indigenous languages and bringing that to their national attention. And then we're at Linguapax North America. So here we are, and I invite you to help me as the representative of North America to engage in activities. I mentioned at the beginning that I'd been working with Indigenous languages, and I wanted to say that in the year 2015, Canada had a commission for the rights of Indigenous people. It was a commission that went across, or prior to that, there were calls and meetings across the country, and that resulted in calls to action, 94 calls to action. And those calls to action were in many fields, in business, in healthcare, in education, and in government, to bring more inclusion of Indigenous people and acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been done, particularly with our residential schools. And as I watch what's been happening since that time, 2015, about a decade, and I know of Joshua Fishman's GIDS, I can see how the actions have been moving through those different stages. So we now have Indigenous language television programs. Our CBC radio broadcasters have which is a national broadcasting corporation, have several weekly shows about Indigenous peoples and about developments among Indigenous groups. So not in Indigenous languages, but certainly helping the country to become aware of contributions of Indigenous peoples prior and now. I mentioned the involvement in FEL Canada. I have to say, on a little sadder note, I have approached a number of my Canadian colleagues who have been, quite prominent in the field of second language acquisition to see if they would join or start a local group in other cities. And basically, I did not get a positive reception. In other words, I think the world of academics really wants to separate itself from the world of activism, sadly. But I haven't given up. I still work with the International Heritage and Languages Association and different Indigenous groups. I'm looking at the time, and these are just some of the projects I've been involved in, working on videos for children on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, monitoring changes in community schools as a result of refugees arriving or as a result of new immigrant groups arriving. I'm interested in how teachers instill their values for languages or for peace education or for developing a worldview in their day-to-day teaching without having a curriculum to back them up, and also developing a Ukrainian language app. So that's going to create some time for discussion. And I'll close off by just saying thank you for your attention. I don't think we lost too many people, so that's always a good sign.